Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Bob. Lovely to be here.
Well, I'm very glad to have you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're Margaret Werthiem, very well known science writer. You've written a number of books, many of them having to do with physics, right? Like Pythagoras' Trousers is largely about physics. Physics on the Fringe is certainly about physics.
Yes, all my books really have been about the cultural history of physics and the ways in which physics intersects with wider streams in our culture, like religion,
Right.
art, etc.
Exactly. I mean, one interesting thing about you, compared with many science writers, not that they aren't interesting in their own right, is that you do look at the larger picture. You look at the intersection of science with philosophy, with religion, with aesthetics, and that brings up questions about, you know, the connection between science and the mind and consciousness, and the limits of science. Or does science have limits as a mode of inquiry, and so on? All the deep philosophical issues are tend to come up in your work, and so I'm very happy we're going to have a chance to get to as many of these as possible. But let me start out with one of your more recent and offbeat sounding initiatives, which is that you co-founded with your identical twin sister something called the Institute for Figuring.
Yes.
Is that now that demands explanation, and I think you're the one to do it, not me.
Well, the Institute for Figuring, you'll probably recognize as a science person, Bob, that its acronym is if and only if, which is the logical symbol. Sorry, its acronym is IFF,
IFF,
which is the logical symbol for if and only if. And we like this name because figuring is a word that connotes many different disciplines. So figures are numbers, figures are mathematical diagrams. We all have a figure, which artists draw figures. And of course, we're all constantly in the process of figuring things out. The mission of the Institute for Figuring is, it comes out of my work as a science communicator. Basically, what I want to do is to use the Institute for Figuring as a way to engage people creatively with science, mathematics, and engineering subjects, but through processes that are often more affiliated with the arts, such as getting people to build stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole initiative was basically precipitated by the fact that about 10 or 12 years ago when I started the Institute, I myself felt that science communication had become a bit limited. If you looked at who reads science magazines, which I did a lot of research on this one about that time, it's basically, in a nutshell, well-off white men over 40, which is not a value judgment at all. It's just
Right.
a
Some of my
statistical.
best friends fit that demographic, I must say.
some some of mine too. But I think that we need more ways of reaching out to more sectors of our society. And indeed, lots of men don't read science magazines. So I started this organization to basically do science communication in a more creative and, as it were, artistically inflected way.
Okay. And so you're right. It's a very multifaceted word, figuring. And I mean, the facets kind of intersect, right? Because I mean, when you look at figures in the sense of physical structures,
Yes,
there's often a mathematics implied by them or evident in them, which brings up the word figuring in the sense of mathematics, right?
yes,
And and then there's often in turn a relationship, like if you're looking at biological structures, like that exhibit regularity, like coral reefs or various other things, the kind of mathematical regularity they embody in turn reflects something about physical law and the law, and maybe the laws of physics governing their environment, like, things like water pressure that they have to cope with or whatever. I mean, is this making sense?
yes. So one of the projects that we do, which is the thing that we're most well known for, is my sister and I began 10 years ago a project to crochet a coral reef. And we now work with communities all over the world. We've literally worked in a dozen countries in 40 different cities on building these community reefs with people from everywhere from New York and London and Sydney to Abu Dhabi. And the project comes from the fact that when you see coral reefs and the frilly crenellated structures they make, those structures are biological manifestations of a kind of mathematics called hyperbolic geometry, which is an alternative to the Euclidean geometry we learn about at school. And a wonderful thing is that although human mathematicians spent hundreds of years trying to prove that hyperbolic structures were impossible, nature has been doing it, particularly in the sea, for hundreds of millions of years. And it turns out that although brainless corals and brainless kelps can easily make hyperbolic structures, it's quite difficult for humans to actually make models of this. But in 1997, a mathematician at Cornell, Dr. Dana Taimina, discovered that you could do it with crochet, which was pretty amazing. And with the crochet models, you can stitch theorems onto the surface and show that things like parallel lines and triangles behave differently in hyperbolic space than they behave in Euclidean space.
Now, can I it's been a while since I took geometry, decades and decades. Is Euclidean geometry, is it confined to 2 dimensions or confined to 3 dimensions? It's
Good question. So you can have Euclidean geometries in any number of dimensions, but let's just restrict ourselves for the discussion at the moment to 2 dimensions. So, we learn Euclidean geometry at school, and we just, learn about, we can draw the Euclidean figures on the surface of a piece of paper. So let's just stick to 2 dimensions, and I can talk about 3-dimensional case in a bit. So in a flat piece of paper, that's 2 dimensions. And you can draw parallel lines, and the quality of parallel lines is they stay the same distance apart forever. And you can draw triangles, and one of the qualities of triangles is that they always have all triangles, the interior angles add up to 180 degrees.
right.
But those 2 things that I've just told you are not true on the 2 other geometries that we know of. So the 2 other kinds of geometry that we have, one is spherical geometry, which is the surface of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And think about what you know about the surface of the Earth. If you look at the lines of longitude where they cross the equator, they're all parallel to one another.
Right.
But yet they come together at the North and South Pole.
Right. That's what I had in mind when I naively said, is it confined to 2 dimensions? I was remembering that when you get to the surface of the globe, it's not Euclidean, but you're right. That's not because it's 3-dimensional per se. It's because the surface itself, you're dealing with a surface, and the surface is not flat.
That's right. The surface itself, and you're putting it very well, the surface itself is 2-dimensional, even though the shape overall appears from the outside to enclose a 3-dimensional space. But from what mathematicians have a way of naming this, they say that it is intrinsically 2-dimensional. So from the point of view of a critter living on that surface, they're only aware that they live on a 2-dimensional surface, even though they could walk around their surface and come back to where they started, and therefore they would be able to tell that they lived on a sphere rather than a flat surface, which is effectively what we humans figured out at some point a couple of thousand years ago. Mm-hmm. The Greeks figured out that we lived not on a flat surface, but on a spherical surface.
Okay, and so this crocheting project, is this like 3-dimensional? Well again, no, it's crocheting. It's crocheting. Well, you tell me what it is.
Well, okay, so if you think about a flat surface like a sphere, a flat surface like the Euclidean, you think about the Euclidean plane as a flat surface, and if you kind of wrap it up on itself, you can imagine turning it into a sphere by kind of wrapping it up around, attaching itself to each other. But imagine that I did the opposite. Imagine I took the flat surface and kind of moved everything, stretched everything and made it move away from itself. Well, that's the structure that's called a hyperbolic plane, and geometrically it's the opposite of a sphere. You shouldn't worry if you're feeling bamboozled by this, because frankly, the greatest mathematicians in our culture felt bamboozled by it, and in fact were nearly driven mad by trying to understand this structure. But here's a nice way of thinking about it. If you think about the flat Euclidean surface, it has no curves, so it's technically classified by mathematicians as having 0 curvature. You can look at a sphere and say, oh, it's got a different kind of curvature. Mathematicians call that positive curvature. And so if it makes sense that there's a positive curvature thing, then it sort of makes sense there'd be a negative curvature thing. And that's what the hyperbolic plane is. It's a negative curvature surface. So in a sense, it's like the geometric equivalent of the negative numbers.
Okay.
Now, there's lots of ways of understanding this, and none of them were intuitively easy for mathematicians. But one way is to just look at the behavior of simple things like parallel lines and triangles on this surface. And in a hyperbolic surface, parallel lines don't always stay the same distance apart. In fact, they get further and further away from each other. And in this surface also, triangles and circles behave strangely. So the inner angles of a triangle add up to less than 180 on a hyperbolic surface. And in fact, in the extreme case, in the biggest possible triangle you can draw, the inner angles of a triangle add up to 0. Now, why does this matter? It matters because the discovery of hyperbolic geometry actually ushered in basically a revolution in geometry, which led mathematicians in the 19th century to really generalize geometry to make it a much, much more powerful system in which they could understand lots more different kinds of structures. And it's that ultimately led to what's called Riemannian geometry, which is the geometry that Einstein used for the general theory of relativity.
Okay. And you've got people all over the world involved in this crocheting project, and
yes.
and they're aware of the connection to non-Euclidean geometry and the connection to coral reefs?
Yes. So we have people all over the world crocheting corals, and that's because what we do is individual people, sometimes hundreds or even up to 1,000 people in an individual city or state, will crochet corals, and then we bring them all together and assemble them into a vast topography that looks like a living reef, a very large, a large living reef, and that gets exhibited in science museums and art galleries. And the reason that we're doing this in part is not only to teach the people who are doing it about geometry and the foundations of mathematics, but also to draw attention to the plight of coral reefs, which, as you know, Bob, are being devastated all over the world. So the project really has a huge ecological dimension. It's trying to say, look, people, global warming is not something in the distant past, in the distant future. It's here and now. Coral reefs now, scientists are saying just this last month, they may disappear by the end of this century, even before the end of this century. We must try to preserve them.
And I assume if people Google Institute for Figuring and Crocheting, they can get more information about this.
Yes, and they can Google crochet coral reef. We have a huge website. And for those of people who are in New York, there's a very beautiful exhibition of the project on at the Museum of Arts and Design that's just opened. So that's on Columbus Circle in Midtown Manhattan.
Okay, great. Now, what we've already gotten into a little is what happens when the mathematics we use to describe physical reality start kind of testing our ability to envision them in a way. And that has gone a lot further with modern physics, right? Where you get something like quantum physics where the math continues to work, but the reality it points to is pretty literally inconceivable, right? So the examples are familiar. The idea of the wave-particle duality, like an electron for some purposes it seems to behave like a particle, for some purposes like a wave. That seems to depend to some extent on decisions you make about measuring it, and what do you make of the seeming incomprehensibility of modern physics?
Well, I think this question of what Eugene Wigner famously called the unreasonable effectiveness in mathematics, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, it is really one of the great philosophical questions of our time. We know that the equations of general relativity have been tested to something like 15 decimal places. The equations of quantum mechanics, some of them have been shown to be correct to more than 20 decimal places of accuracy. So these theories are showing us deep and important facets of the way the world works. But it's extremely difficult to know how to interpret them as models of physical reality, particularly with the quantum theories. And I think this presents us with a very big sociological, I think it presents us with several problems. One of which is a sociological problem, which is this. if we have a theory or description of the universe, which is the official description of our universe that's presented in places like the New York Times and on TV, PBS programs, etc. But that description of the universe can't be understood by 99.99% of our population, then I think that's a problem. Because what do people do? If one of the functions of science is supposedly to make us feel at home in the cosmos, as Kaufman has suggested, and I agree with him that should be one of the functions of science.
This is Stuart Kaufman?
Stuart Kaufman, mm-hmm. Yeah. What happens if the majority of people can't even begin to feel at home in that cosmos because they can't even begin to understand it? And I think I call this the cosmological problem. And we're at that point now, and I think it's a pretty unusual point in history because, it's almost as if our official picture of reality can only be understood by, a few 10,000 people on Earth.
Well, can it even be understood by them? I mean, Richard Feynman kind of famously said in his book, I think, The Character of Physical Law, he said, it used to be said that there was a time when nobody could understand relativity. He said that was wrong. There was always somebody. Einstein really understood relativity. He said, but it is not the case that anyone truly understands quantum physics, right?
Yes.
There's in other words, it gets, there are certain ideas in science that are so obscure that only a very small number of people understand them. But Feynman himself, who won the Nobel Prize for insights into quantum physics, said that there was a sense in which he did not understand quantum physics.
Yes. But I think that there's a huge desire in the parts of many people to understand science. I don't actually buy the idea that we live in an anti-science world at all. I actually think we live in a world in which an awful lot of people want to understand science, but there just aren't ways in for them. So I think we have a crisis in the representation of science, a crisis in science education, and a crisis in the public, in the movement to engage people publicly in science, which I think is really failing in a lot of ways. Now, could we get to a point where everyone could understand quantum theory and general relativity? I'm not sure that we could, and at least not beyond a certain point. I think there's a certain amount of it that we can explain, but I think there is a problem that the theories, as you say, have become so difficult, and particularly when you look at the attempts to fuse them with things like string theory or loop quantum gravity. I think these theories really are beyond what most ordinary people who don't have degrees in physics and mathematics, And so I think that we are presented with a difficult sociological problem. But I think that there's another problem, which is that if we look at the mathematical theories, as I said earlier, we know that they're correct to 10 or 20 decimal places. They are telling us powerful structural things about the underlying natures of reality. But is this a theory of everything? And is it something which should be given that kind of status or even discussed in those words? And I would like to challenge that, because I don't believe that no matter how much we understand about particle physics or even neurology, I don't believe that is going to make us understand, say, love or joy or fear or hate. And I think that we're entering a time where I think the claims about what can be explained through physical science, I think, are being somewhat inflated in a way that has some fairly problematic repercussions.
Okay. One thing about before we move into the issue you've just raised, I say one interesting thing about the weirdness of quantum physics and to some extent relativity from a point of view of scientific literacy is the weirdness of it has an alluring effect. It actually gets people interested, right? No, I find that when you talk about the weirdness of quantum physics, people pay attention. The weirdness intrigues them. And so that might be, a feature more than a bug from the point of view of scientific education. Of course, then you run into the problem that once you explain it to them, you can teach them a certain number of actual things, but there's a limit on the extent to which they can intuitively comprehend and visualize what is said
Yeah.
to be going on, right?
I mean, I think you're right that for certain people, the weirdness of quantum mechanics is, as you say, a feature, not a bug. I think that's true for some people. I think a lot of people just find it off-putting. I think there's a lot of other people who just throw up their hands and say, well, I can't understand that. I mean, one of the reasons I started writing my own books about the history of physics was because I kept having the following experience. Although I studied physics and maths at university, most of my friends are in the arts. They went to art school. And people would keep coming up to me at parties and saying, Margaret, I bought A Brief History of Time and I couldn't get past chapter 1. Tell me a book about physics that I could actually understand. And I kept hearing this, and I couldn't really recommend anything because most of the books that the physicists write are really not comprehensible to someone who hasn't really done a lot of serious reading already. So I thought I would try to write a book. And in doing my first book, it was an attempt to make sense of what physicists say about the nature of reality by putting it into cultural context and historical context. How did we get to this point? Why were they asking the questions? What was at stake when you ask a question like, is the sun or the earth at the center of the cosmos? And many, many times I hear people say, oh, I tried to read Brian Greene's book and I couldn't make head or tail of it. I've concluded that I just don't have the right kind of mind for science. Now, that's a tragedy. Your ability to do or not do science should not be measured, or your inadequacy in science should not be signaled by the fact that you can't understand string theory.
Okay. So, and actually, I mean, string theory, the basic metaphors that are used to convey it are graspable.
Yeah.
I mean, it has these, until they start saying that one implication of it is you have like 10 dimensions or however many it is instead of 3 or 3 plus time or whatever, then it does kind of, it strains the mind. But,
Yes,
but anyway, I would say Brian Greene's about as good as it's going to get on string theory, and he's a good expositor, but it's inherently problematic material.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's the thing when people are told that we live in a 10 or 11 dimensional manifold, what does that mean to them? What can it mean to someone who hasn't studied?
Okay.
What can it mean to someone who hasn't formally studied mathematics to be told that we live in a 10 or 11 dimensional universe in which gravity might be leaking off our 4-dimensional brain into another brain? I mean, most people throw up their hands and say, I really don't understand a bar of that. And I mean, I personally love reading about this stuff because I've got degrees in physics and math, but I am really, really concerned and really interested in the question of how can we take this, really, it is a very elite activity doing theoretical physics, and turn it into something that is accessible to a much wider proportion of our people. And I am concerned that there is a tension building. I mix equally in the arts and the sciences, and I see a fair bit of hostility coming from the sciences towards what is being done in the arts. People who are saying this is not so much about physics, but the hostility, there is a lot of hostility now saying, well, people like psychologists or psychiatrists or historians or anthropologists, those kinds of fields are supposedly becoming dead, and the kinds of explorations that they're taking on should be done by hard sciences. And equally, I see hostility from humanities peoples who feel very under threatened these days, in a lot of them, because their jobs are really being taken away as more and more resources in universities are being given to things like neuroscience. And they see, the sciences are just claiming epistemological supremacy, and without actually acknowledging the great resources of knowledge and insight that do come from subjects like history and sociology.
Yeah. I mean, the main hostility, I guess, I've sensed emanating from, people who purport to be speaking on behalf of science or from the standpoint of science, is really toward, I would say, religion and philosophy more than. I mean, they may mock the ineffectuality of the social sciences in being predictive or something, and they may say someday this will all be reduced to physical laws, and they finally will be predictive, and they'll become true sciences. But I've gotten more. I would say I feel more of a sense of threat among philosophers and like maybe theologians and religious believers from science than I do so much from social scientists. Now, of course, there are social sciences such as anthropology, maybe where there's some kind of postmodern influence that tends to be mocked by certain people. But I would say that's a little less true of things like political science and history. Anyway, there is a certain amount of ill will floating in both directions, I guess. If you divide the world between the humanities and the sciences, I haven't seen a lot of hostility from scientists toward art. I think they just think of it as like, go ahead, have your fun.
Oh, sorry, I meant arts in the traditional,
in the sense of humanities.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm with you there. So let me ask you. So you got into this question of the limits of science, and the idea that there are things that science just can't explain. I think you mentioned love and things like that. Now, first of all, the idea that science can explain everything and that nothing else, humanities, anything has any role is referred to as scientism, I guess, a very expansive conception of science's legitimate domain. But let me ask you, your view that some things are beyond the ken of science, it sounds like you would have held that view even if we were in the late 19th century and we hadn't yet seen the weirdest things about physics, right? In other words, even if physics were Newtonian still and kind of deterministic and a little easier to make sense of, you would still say that, look, it is in the nature of subjective experience to not be ultimately reducible to physical laws. Is that right?
I think the way that I approach this is, I don't believe that there is, as it were, a soul waiting to be put into a body when the body is conceived. I think that the human being comes into being as a physical entity, and then gradually, a brain and then a psychology develops within that being. What I do believe is that once the psychic structure of the being is formed, once it becomes a sentient being, I don't believe that you can explain, at least what's interesting to me about psychology and the nature of consciousness, through understanding the physiological laws, which doesn't mean to say at all that we're not going to find fascinatingly interesting things by, say, the project of Christoph Koch to find the neurological correlates of consciousness. I think it will be fascinating to see what is going on physiologically when we are, say, frightened, or when we feel elated, or when we feel joy. But I don't think that any amount of understanding and explaining the neural potentials and synapses, etc., is going to capture what is important about love or joy or any of the other emotions. And I think it's a bit like this. It seems to me, I don't actually see this as a particularly controversial position. It seems to me that this is akin to the following. We understand that there is a molecular basis to life. Life, we are all made up of DNA and proteins, and we've got a pretty good handle on how all that works. That said, when we talk about a giraffe, or we talk about giraffes as a group, we don't resort to molecular biology. And we have people studying giraffe habitats and giraffe interactions because we want to hopefully save these critters. And that's got nothing to do with molecular biology, although we now might do DNA samples to see if there are genetic bottlenecks going on. But we understand giraffes, as it were, as a thing that exists, as it were, at some level of descriptiveness, where the physical stuff underneath them is not really the important stuff. And I think that's true of human behavior. I'm not opposed to people doing neurological studies or DNA studies at all. I think it's all fascinating. But I think the most insightful book I've ever read about human behavior is The Divine Comedy, Dante's book, which was written, in 1420. 1320. I don't think that, that book is ever going to be superseded as a source of insight about the human psyche, because humans actually are whole beings with complex sets of relationships that in and of themselves become a worthy study of a worthy subject of study, that cannot ever be, that part of us cannot be reduced to the laws of physics.
Now, is that partly because subjective experience is inherently private? I mean, you can measure correlates of it in a very scientific way, and I mean, you can see what's going on with the neurons, or while someone is saying, "I feel afraid." But and the report that they feel afraid is also something that's publicly observable. But the actual feeling of afraidness is something that only they have access to, right? I mean,
yes, and I think that there is that inner subjectivity of it, that, as you say, the feeling of intense privacy. And I think there's also another thing, which is that each of us feels afraid, whatever afraid is, under very, very different conditions. So afraidness, the notion of afraidness, is affiliated with completely different things for different people. So here's the thing. I'm terrified of snakes. Even though I grew up in Australia where we had lots of them, it's the one thing I'm absolutely phobic about. I can happily rescue people from spiders. Picking up big crawly spiders doesn't bother me one bit. Some people aren't afraid of any animals, but I know people who are absolutely terrified to get on airplanes. I can't relate to that at all. I have no fear of airplanes. Some people are absolutely terrified to sit exams. Some people are terrified to have their photo taken. So, even if we work out what exactly is neurologically going on during the emotion of fear, that in no way casts light on what are the things that I feel frightened about, or you feel frightened about, or the person across the street feels frightened about. That seems to me to be inherently personal and somehow related to your history, your unique history.
Okay. Why do you think? Do you agree that it seems that there has been kind of a growing respect for the difficulty of explaining consciousness, subjective experience, in a certain sense? I think when Daniel Dennett's book on consciousness came out, I don't know, it's probably been 20 years now or more, there was a sense, well, certainly that book tried to convey a sense, that this is no big mystery.
Yeah.
And the book had a lot of enthusiastic readers, and I think some of them took it to be like, okay, this is where philosophy has gotten, no big mystery.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the bulk of both actual academic writing in philosophy since then and kind of popular writing has been a little more respectful of the difficulty of the problem, explaining why there is subjective experience. If in principle a physical body if in principle a strictly physical squirrel could do all the things a squirrel does, why does a squirrel have to, as they presumably do, feel pain when they are, attacked or something? These kinds of questions, I think, have gotten more play over the last couple of decades. I'm wondering if you agree that that's the case, and if you do, if you have an explanation as to why.
Well, I think that when Daniel Dennett's book came out, and it was around about the time, as I recall, that Steven Pinker's book How the Mind Works came out. There was a sort of cluster of these books.
Late 90s, I guess.
Yeah, the late 90s, when it was as if, problem solved, let's move on. But as you say, 20 years later, Bob, there's, sometimes I think if I had $1 for every time I read the words, I've got a theory of consciousness, I'd be rich by now. But I think things have got more respectful in the sense that I think a lot of people realise now that the problem is very complex. What to even articulate? What do you mean when you say consciousness? It seems to mean different things to different people who write these books. And there's a realisation, I think, that there's so many of these books have been coming out, and none of them have been universally accepted. So there's clearly we are at the beginning of something, not at the end of it. And my sense is that, as it were, the science of trying to understand consciousness will be a project for, I personally believe this will be a project for hundreds of years. And I think because to me, I believe that this is a hard problem. I mean, whether you take it literally in David Chalmers' sense, this is a very hard problem. In the attempts, most of the books at least are coming out by scientists are attempts to explain it from it. You know, how do we explain the it of consciousness increasingly from some sort of flow of information at the neuronal level? It seems that information theory is the big goer, at least a very fashionable goer, in terms of understanding and trying to explain what consciousness is. I guess from my personal point of view, I have less interest in the question of what consciousness is, because I'm not even sure that we can really answer that any more than we can answer the question, what is love? I think there will be endless speculations, endless insights into that question for as long as humans are around. I'm interested in the issue of what are the responsibilities of conscious beings? If we are conscious, which I think we are, what are the responsibilities that we face when we are as conscious beings? And I mean, this has, I think, Patricia Churchland once talked about this question. She said she was less interested in the idea anymore of what free will is, but more really in when does a person have free will, and when can they be held responsible with that free will? So, for instance, do you have free will if you're drunk out of your mind? Do you have? Can you be considered to have free will if you're in a state of extreme post-traumatic stress syndrome? Can you be considered to have free will if you're in a state of utter rage because you've just found out that your partner has left you? And so I think consciousness is in the same class as free will, and obviously it's allied with free will. Is if we are conscious, when are we conscious, and what is our responsibilities as conscious beings? And I think that's a far more fascinating set of questions than endless quibbling about what is consciousness and how does it arise.
Okay. Notwithstanding that, let me raise one more piece of endless quibbling about one more question about consciousness and physics. It's this that I think in the background here sometimes is the question of which is more fundamental, what we think of as the physical world out there or the subjective world in here. And I think, like, for example, one view that's, I think, commonly implied by scientists, they may not even have this very well articulated in their minds, but I think it's kind of implicit in their view, especially behavioral scientists, is that subjective experience is just kind of a shadow cast by the physical workings. So, like, the neurons corresponding, or all the physical information processing corresponding to my withdrawing my hand from a flame leads to the feeling of pain, but the pain is not the driving thing. The driving thing is the physical information in my arm. That's what gets me to pull the arm back. And this is, of course, one of the things that leads to the question of, well, then why is subjective experience here if it's not doing anything? So, but anyway, in that view, it's like the physical stuff that's fundamental. Subjective experience is kind of a shadow that's cast. There is the alternative view that, in some sense, consciousness or subjective experience is more fundamental than the world out there. And this is cropped up occasionally in interpretations of quantum physics. This issue of, like, whether... it seems to be the case that, like, measuring the electron forces what was just a wave of probabilities to collapse into more definite form. And some people, I don't think this is a majority view in physics, but some people have taken that to mean that it's actually the act of observing. It's the conscious being that forces the collapse of the wave functioning. Again, the wave function. Again, I don't think that's a majority view, but in any event, it shows you how you could start viewing the consciousness as the more fundamental thing, the thing that brings reality into existence. Now, do I remember correctly that you have expressed views on this subject, or am I reading too much into some of your past comments on the question of which is more fundamental?
Well, I think this question of which is the more fundamental is also very difficult because, in a sense, what do you mean by that?
Right.
I do not believe that physical definitions of consciousness are going to get to the things that I believe are the essence of consciousness. I believe that however consciousness comes into being, that like life, once it is there, it is a fundamental aspect of reality, and it needs its own discourse and language. Just as I was saying earlier, once life comes into being, you start talking about giraffes and elephants and peacocks and dolphins as things in themselves. You don't keep reverting to the language of molecular biology. And I think consciousness is like that. Once it comes into being, however it comes into being, I think once it's there, it is, as it were, a phenomena that can no longer be adequately described in terms of the laws of physics, which isn't to say that studying the underlying structures might not show us interesting things. And a big part of the reason I'm committed to this is for the same reason, going back to Descartes, who I think gets a very bad rap in the history of science. I think Descartes is actually a very extraordinary thinker. And one of the things that Descartes, the one who's credited with dividing the world into what he called the res extensa, the physical realm of matter in motion, and what he called the res cogitans, the realm of humans' thoughts, feelings, emotions, and ultimately also for him religious experience. I'm committed to the ontological primacy of the res cogitans. It doesn't necessarily mean it's more primary than the res extensa, but I think it is a not derivative realm. And the reason this matters, I think, is for the reason that it has always mattered, which is the moral dimension. If we do not have the ability as moral animals, to use your phrase, Robert, to genuinely make moral decisions, then the whole realm of ethics becomes a sham. So if we are just being guided by the laws of physics, then how is there any real sense of moral accountability? How does moral choice act? And I'm committed to the notion that we must have moral choice. We must have free will to make decisions, and that we therefore have responsibility to ourselves, to other beings, and to the wider universe to think about and to try to make good moral decisions. And if we are just simply enactments of the laws of physics, then I don't see how we can have choice. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think this idea is so difficult to get to go away. Mm-hmm. Every time you see some sort of reductionist account of things, when you burrow into it, it just elides over the notion that there is genuine free will.
Yeah. Let me, at this point, try to bring my dogs into the picture. Like, one interesting thing about dogs mm-hmm. is that you can just stare into their eyes for a long period of time lovingly. And the reason that's interesting is because it's actually very hard to do with a person. I mean, there's a famous saying in anthropology that if you see two people staring directly at each other for more than 5 seconds, that means they're either going to have a fight or make love. It just doesn't persist, right? Yeah. Something is about to change. But with a dog, you can look directly at a being that you really love, and the being will look back directly at you. And
Yes.
every once in a while, I get this weird feeling. Although my basic impulse is the basic way I think about the world is very mechanistic and kind of reductionist. I just sometimes it's like so intense that I think, what if the love is more fundamental? What if the subjective connection is like a kind of a magnetism that is like drawing, right? Which seems crazy to me the rest of the time, because like I said, I'm pretty reductionistic, but it's my way of asking how much of your thinking about this and your skepticism about the reductionism, how reductionism can be applied to consciousness and subjective experience. How much of this, if any, has to do not just with the way things feel, like it feels hot, it feels cold, but the way encountering other people feels, right? The relationship of your consciousness to the consciousness of other people. Does that figure into your?
Oh yes. I mean, I think that relationships with others have definitely shaped my views about what I think science can and can't do. And one of the big relationships that shaped my views of everything really is the fact that I'm an identical twin. And I mean, I think my sister and I are an interesting case study for science. We have the same genes. Until we were 17, we'd never spent more than 36 hours apart. We slept in the same room together all through our childhood. Often we slept in the same bed. So we couldn't have had a more, we have the same physiological makeup, and we had exactly the same psychological conditions, apparently, when we were growing up. But yet we are fundamentally different people as adults. So different that I actually think she's the most alien person I know.
Really?
And yeah, yes.
You mean in terms of intellectual interests or also in terms of personality?
In terms of both. I mean, she is so wildly different from me, it's hard for me to comprehend that. And I think one way of thinking about this is it is like a psychological version of the butterfly effect. You know, the butterfly effect in
Right.
chaos theory, a butterfly
flapping its wings in South America and can lead to a hurricane in North America 2 months later.
Yes. So, you know, in complex systems, things that start very close together inevitably get radically apart and different. And I believe the human psyche is like that. I mean, if two people like Christine and I, who have so much in common, can end up so different, that suggests to me that actually whatever fundamental laws might be discovered about human nature, that within those laws that the possibility for radical difference way outweighs whatever the commonalities are.
Okay. Let me ask you one question, and then I will try to come up with a reductionist theory. I'll throw a reductionist theory about your relations with Christine at you and see how you handle it. But would you say, has there been less conflict between you two than you think there is typically between siblings? Less strife, more altruism?
No, I would say that being an identical twin is the hardest relationship of my life. Sometimes I say to people, it's being like married from the moment of conception with no concept of divorce. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and like a good marriage, I mean, there's no such thing as a marriage that people don't have to work on. And twindom is in some ways a pathological relationship. It's amazing in some ways. It's also very difficult in other ways. And you have to really work on it. There have been times in Chrissy and my life where we've just had huge differences. And on both sides, we've worked incredibly hard to understand the other person's. And, you know, we come from a family where there are 6 kids in my family. We were a good Catholic family. So I know what it's like to have relationships with other siblings. And I think the thing is, just being a twin, you do feel just almost existentially committed to making it work, whatever the differences are. So you do have to spend really serious time on understanding one another.
Here's a question I don't expect you to answer, but would you be more inclined to run into a burning building to save your twin sister than, I'll tell you why I'm asking later, but after this, but would you be more inclined to run into a burning building to save your twin sister than your other siblings?
Yes, I think I can say that, yes, because she feels she's a part of me. She is an alien being, but she is a part of me.
Okay, here's my attempt to reductionistically explain everything about your relationship. I mean, first of all, your feeling more altruistic to her is consistent with so-called kin theory, which argues that the closer the degree of genetic relationship, in theory, the more altruism could evolve. I mean, she is a clone of you. In Darwinian terms, saving her is like saving yourself. Now, it doesn't follow that natural selection would necessarily pick up on that fact and build into the human mind particular altruism. That would depend on like how common has identical twindom been and a lot of questions. But that could actually be a biological adaptation, that when people perceive their identical twins, they become more altruistic than they usually would be towards siblings. That's a possible explanation. On the issue of how different you are, there is a whole theory, I think, of child development that sees children adapting to other siblings as part of their ecosystem in a sense, and there can be a displacement effect, although I've usually seen this explained in terms of like older and younger siblings. So like if I come along and my brother is already the athletic star and he's getting the commendation for that, and my dad loves him for that, and then it's been posited that there's a tendency for the younger sibling to find something, their comparative advantage. Well, they can be the good kid and get praised for that, or they can be the studious kid. So there is it has been argued that siblings can kind of displace each other personality-wise in a certain sense, and that would be in a way itself adaptive and governed by a psychological adaptation. But I suspect I have not shaken you from your view that you're...
Yes, I know that theory. I understand that theory, and one can easily find examples among one's friends and siblings where things like that are going on. I think twindom is, particularly being an identical twin, is a very unique kind of a relationship, and the reason is that when you're growing up and you look very alike, people can't tell you apart, and so you get. People just say, "Oh, you did blah blah yesterday, Margaret," and you think, "No, I didn't. Christine did it," and you quickly learn to actually, as it were, have a split personality. I think the fantasy a lot of people have with being an identical twin is, "Oh, isn't that cool? There's someone else who gets to live the same life as you." Actually, to Chrissy and I, the great thing about being identical twins is we do feel we've got to live two lives, two completely different lives. So here's for instance, when we left school, I went to university and studied physics and mathematics. She went to art school and initially became a painter, and now teaches in one of the big arts colleges in America. So, I feel through her, I've had a life in arts as well as my own life in science, and she feels through me, she's had a life in science as well as the life she's had in the arts. I wouldn't have had that opportunity had I not been an identical twin, but I do really feel I've been privileged to lead two lives. But that's one of the reasons it comes back to, it's not easy. It's hard. It's time consuming to lead two lives, and you have to understand something about why the other person's life is so different from yours. So I don't think that is necessary, that quality of actually, it is like entanglement. I do think of Chrissy and I as like two entangled psychologies, like two entangled particles. It doesn't matter where in the world we are, and for 20 years we lived in different countries, that our lives are entangled like two quantum particles.
But you don't mean that actually there's a magical kind of instantaneous influence exerted as with the two particles? Or maybe you do. Wouldn't defy the laws of physics given the fact of entanglement, I guess. It
is true that strange things happen on that sense. Strange things do happen, which one can try to come up with all sorts of explanations for them. But yes, there does seem to be as it were, psychic connections across vast distances.
Okay. Well,
Not that I'm going to argue that that should be necessarily explained through quantum theory.
okay. Leads to, I guess, a natural final question in an oblique way. You mentioned that you were raised Catholic. I think I've read that you're no longer any kind of conventionally believing Catholic, but you don't describe yourself as an atheist. Is there any way of characterizing, well, what your current position is along that spectrum, or maybe how having been raised religiously influences your conception of the universe or anything?
Well, that's an easier question to answer, Robert. I'll answer that one first. I think being raised a Catholic has influenced me fundamentally as a human being, because my parents, the form of Catholicism that they believed in, they were intellectual Catholics. They came, my father was a professor of philosophy at a university. They believed fundamentally that the primary teaching of Catholicism was thou shalt assist those less fortunate than you. And so that kind of mendicant tradition of Christianity was deeply ingrained into us, that you have a moral responsibility on earth to be a decent human being, which does mean assisting those who do not have all the advantages that you've had. And I believe in that very strongly, and I believe that that's shaped my life fundamentally. On the question of what is my own personal faith belief, I like to put it in the following way. I don't know that I believe in God, but when I read the Divine Comedy, I believe that Dante believes in God. And I believe, when Dante gets to the end of the journey in the Divine Comedy and he pierces the universe and bursts through the physical reality and comes face to face with, as he puts it, the sun, the love that moves the sun and the other stars, I do believe that there is a source, a force of love in the universe that somehow I do believe I will connect with at some point. I don't know if that is God in a classical sense, but I do believe in something like that.
Okay. Well, it may not be God in a classical sense, but I think by standards of modern liberal theology, it qualifies as a religious view of the world.
Yes, it probably does. Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Okay.
And I don't see that as being remotely in conflict with my love of science. I think science is, I've devoted my life to to trying to engage the public with scientific issues and trying to make science and mathematics accessible to more people. And I do actually find it very troubling and somewhat a bit incomprehensible why there is so much perceived hostility between science and religion. I do, of course, understand some of the reasons why, but I think on both sides, a little more humility would go a long way.
Okay. Well, I'll try to do my part. Thank you so much, Margaret, for taking the time. And again, people can Google your books, Pythagoras' Trousers and Pearly Gates of Cyberspace, and many others. And what is and they can Google the crochet coral reef thing.
Yes.
And then what is the museum in New York where there's right now an exhibit involving your stuff?
It's the Museum of Arts and Design.
Okay.
And it's on Columbus Circle.
Okay.
So it's in Midtown Manhattan.
Right. How long is it there?
It's there till the 22nd of January.
Oh, good. Okay.
So lots of time to see it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. Take care.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.